The year was 1790, and deep in the snow-covered valleys of Norway, a story began to take shape that has lingered in whispers for more than 2 centuries. It is the story of a woman who, according to frightened villagers and incredulous hunters, spoke with wolves long after they were dead. Her name is scarcely remembered in records, often mentioned only in passing or not at all, but her legend has survived through folklore, fragments of local oral history, and the uneasy silence of official documents that preferred to leave such matters unspoken. The tale is not merely about a strange woman in a remote village. It is about the way fear, faith, and the shadow of superstition can shape how a community sees one of its own. To imagine the atmosphere of 18th century Norway is to imagine isolation. Harsh winters locked villagers away for months at a time. Wolves prowled the forests, both feared as real predators and dreaded as supernatural symbols of death and destruction. In this setting, stories carried more weight than facts, because stories could explain what the eye saw but the mind could not make sense of. If a wolf carcass seemed to stir in the moonlight, if strange sounds echoed across the fjords, it was far easier to believe in omens and curses than to trust the slow, rational voice of reason. Against this backdrop, the legend of the wolf-speaking woman thrived. Her story begins not with a single event, but with whispers. Hunters told of finding her near the carcass of a wolf, speaking in a low voice as if addressing an old friend. Children claimed to hear guttural noises, like growls or half-formed words, when she passed by in the village. Farmers swore she predicted storms and deaths after listening to the silence of a wolf grave. Over time, these scattered reports wove themselves together into a reputation. She was not simply strange, she was something otherworldly, someone who could reach across the boundary between the living and the dead. In a world where wolves were already tied to death, omens, and the supernatural, this was not a gift to be admired. It was a curse to be feared. But the fascination lies not only in what villagers claim she did, but in the way her story survived. Europe at this time was slowly shifting toward modernity. The Enlightenment had already taken root in larger cities, championing science and rationality. But in rural Norway, the old ways of thinking still ruled. Christianity was strong, yet beneath it lay the older, pagan beliefs that refused to vanish entirely. People lived with a constant tension between the new rational worldview and the older world of omens, curses, and unseen spirits. This tension created fertile ground for the story of a woman who supposedly spoke with dead wolves. The details of her life remain uncertain, but the themes that surround her legend are clear. They are themes of isolation, both personal and communal. She was said to be a widow, and widows in that era often lived at the margins of society, seen as vulnerable but also potentially dangerous because they stood outside the protection of a husband. She lived near the forest, where wolves roamed, and her isolation seemed to place her closer to nature, and therefore closer to the dangerous mysteries of the wilderness. To her neighbors, she was neither fully part of the village nor entirely outside of it. She occupied a liminal space, and liminal spaces are often where folklore finds its strongest footing. The fear of wolves during this time cannot be overstated. For farmers, wolves represented loss and survival hanging in the balance. A single wolf attack could wipe out livestock, leaving a family destitute. But beyond this practical fear, wolves carried mythic weight. In Norse mythology, wolves devoured the sun and moon at the end of the world. In local folktales, wolves appeared as messengers of death, stalking those who would soon fall ill or perish. If someone was seen to have a special connection with wolves, especially with wolves that were already dead, that person was seen as dangerously close to the world of spirits and death itself. The woman's alleged ability to communicate with these creatures placed her firmly within that dangerous liminal space. To some, she was a necromancer, drawing knowledge from the other side. To others, she was a madwoman, speaking to nothing at all but convincing herself she heard replies. To a few, she was a witch who had found her familiars not among cats or crows, but among the fiercest predators of the forest. No matter the interpretation, she was never viewed as simply an ordinary woman. She was something more, something uncanny. As with many such stories from this time period, the lines between fact and folklore are impossible to draw with certainty. Did she truly claim to hear voices from the carcasses of wolves? Or did frightened villagers, primed by centuries of wolf lore and superstition, project their own fears onto an eccentric woman? The records do not give us clear answers. What they give us instead is a haunting outline of a story. A woman, wolves, whispers of death, and a community desperate to explain what it did not understand. This introduction to her tale is not merely a prologue to a strange local legend. It is an entry point into a world where folklore and reality overlapped so closely that they were nearly indistinguishable. The woman who talked to dead wolves is more than just a curiosity of Norwegian history. She represents the enduring power of myth to fill in the spaces where truth falters. As the story unfolds, we will journey through the cultural landscape of 1790s Norway, the mythology of wolves, the shadow of witchcraft, and the possible psychological and scientific explanations for her behavior. But one thing remains certain: once a legend takes root in the human imagination, it howls across centuries, long after the voices that first told it have gone silent. To understand the story of the woman who spoke to dead wolves, one must first understand the Norway of 1790, a land shaped by both nature and belief, where survival depended on knowledge of the land, the animals, and the invisible forces that seemed to govern them. The country was still largely rural, with small villages and isolated farms scattered across deep fjords and snow-laden valleys. Winters were long and merciless, often keeping families confined indoors for weeks at a time. Food stores had to last through months of darkness and frozen terrain, and the threat of starvation was ever present. In such a world, people learned to respect the environment with an almost religious reverence. The forests themselves were both a source of sustenance and fear. Wolves prowled the edges of settlements, preying on livestock and occasionally daring to come closer to humans. But beyond their physical threat, wolves carried a psychological weight. In the Norwegian imagination, they were creatures of death and darkness. Stories circulated that wolves could sense the approaching demise of a villager, or that a lone wolf howling at night was a messenger from the underworld. To live near the forests was to live with a constant awareness that these silent hunters might be watching, not just for prey, but for souls. Religion further shaped the worldview of rural Norwegians. The Lutheran Church had been the dominant spiritual authority for over a century, yet Christianity in these regions often merged with older, pagan beliefs. Many villagers retained a deep-seated belief in spirits, omens, and supernatural forces, even as they attended church services and followed Christian rites. Folk traditions coexisted with the official religion. Charms, protective rituals, and superstitious warnings were part of daily life. A person who could, or was believed to, communicate with the dead was simultaneously feared and respected, as they seemed to bridge the world of the living with forces beyond comprehension. In this environment, stories of witchcraft and the supernatural were not just entertainments, they were explanations for the unexplainable. When livestock disappeared mysteriously, when strange marks appeared on the snow, or when a sudden illness struck, it was often attributed to curses, spirits, or the intervention of hidden powers. Fear of the unseen was a part of survival. To ignore it was to court disaster. A woman who conversed with dead wolves would therefore not be a curiosity alone. She would be a threat, a figure whose abilities could unsettle the delicate balance between human communities and the dangerous forces of the wild. Life in 1790 Norway was hard, and communities were tight-knit but suspicious. Villages depended on each other for survival, yet they also maintained a heightened awareness of deviance. Anyone who lived differently, behaved oddly, or claimed unusual abilities quickly drew attention. Isolation magnified fear. A widow living alone at the edge of a forest was vulnerable to gossip and speculation, especially when coupled with unexplained events. In the case of the wolf-speaking woman, her position on the fringes of society, physically, socially, and spiritually, made her the perfect vessel for the fears and stories of her neighbors. The tension between rationality and superstition is particularly notable in this period. Enlightenment ideas had begun to spread across Europe, encouraging reason, empirical observation, and skepticism toward the supernatural. Yet in rural Norway, practical concerns often outweighed abstract philosophy. The harshness of daily life required attention to what could be seen, heard, and experienced firsthand, but the invisible forces were never far from thought. Folktales, local legends, and spiritual beliefs served as tools to navigate a world that could be lethal in a moment's notice. Wolves, storms, illnesses, all could carry hidden significance. A woman who claimed to speak with creatures associated with death itself was immediately woven into this interpretive web. The Norwegian landscape played a role in shaping these beliefs. Deep fjords, dense forests, and mountains that blocked sunlight for long periods created an environment where isolation was as much physical as it was psychological. The echo of a wolf's howl across a valley could be haunting, almost spectral, and it was easy to imagine that the animals were carrying messages from the dead. Seasonal changes intensified the drama. The long winter nights encouraged storytelling, while the arrival of spring and the thawing of snow brought the lingering fears of what might have been encountered during the darkness. Social and gender dynamics also added layers of complexity to the story. Women, particularly widows, occupied precarious positions in rural communities. They were often respected for their labor and knowledge of healing, but also suspected of meddling in matters beyond ordinary understanding. Any unusual behavior could be interpreted as witchcraft, necromancy, or communion with spirits. The wolf-speaking woman existed at the intersection of these suspicions. Her gender, her social status, and her isolation made her simultaneously a healer, an oddity, and a potential threat in the eyes of her neighbors. In addition, Norway in 1790 was a place where oral tradition ruled over written records in many areas. Stories of strange events were passed from one generation to the next, often growing with each retelling. This oral culture ensured that legends like that of the wolf-speaking woman could endure long after factual details were forgotten. Each retelling added embellishment, fear, or moral instruction, blending the line between reality and imagination. Villagers were both witnesses and authors of the legend, creating a communal memory that would outlast any individual account. Understanding this world of isolation, fear, and faith is crucial to understanding the legend itself. It was a place where the ordinary and the supernatural overlapped, where survival depended on both practical knowledge and respect for forces that could not be fully controlled. Against this backdrop, a woman claiming to speak with dead wolves would not simply be an oddity, she would be a figure of profound fascination and deep fear. She embodied the tension between the known and the unknown, between life and death, between reason and superstition. By exploring Norway in 1790, we begin to see why her story took root, why it spread, and why it has endured for more than 2 centuries. The landscape, the climate, the cultural beliefs, and the social dynamics all converge to create the perfect environment for a legend that continues to haunt the imagination. It was a world in which wolves were more than animals, faith was inseparable from fear, and the line between life and death could be crossed by those brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to walk at the edges of human understanding. In 18th century Norway, wolves were never just animals. They were embodiments of danger, mystery, and the supernatural, woven deeply into the fabric of folklore and collective imagination. To understand the story of the woman who spoke to dead wolves, one must first grasp the symbolic weight these creatures carried. Wolves were predators of the body and the spirit, feared not only for their physical strength but also for their perceived connection to death and the unknown. Across the fjords and forests, stories abounded of wolves that were more than flesh and fur, wolves that could sense misfortune, act as omens, or even serve as agents of otherworldly forces. Norse mythology had long established the wolf as a creature intertwined with cosmic events. Fenrir, the giant wolf fated to devour the world at Ragnarok, represented the ultimate destructive force. His sons, Skoll and Hati, pursued the sun and moon across the sky, embodying the inexorable passage of time and the inevitability of doom. These ancient myths survived the centuries and filtered into local folklore, blending with Christian morality tales and rural storytelling. To villagers in 1790, a wolf was rarely just a wild animal. It was a symbol of predation, chaos, and spiritual reckoning. Beyond mythology, wolves in Scandinavian folklore carried specific, localized meanings. They were often associated with death, both imminent and lingering. A wolf's howl was considered an announcement of misfortune, a warning of sickness, or a herald of death. Hunters and farmers spoke of spectral wolves that roamed graveyards or prowled near the sites of recent deaths. These were not merely imaginative tales, they were taken seriously. The line between superstition and reality was thin, and the harsh, isolated environment made it easy to perceive the unseen forces at work. A wolf in the forest could be a wolf, or it could be a messenger from another realm. The concept of wolves as intermediaries between the living and the dead added another layer to the cultural imagination. In some regions, it was believed that when a person died violently or unexpectedly, their spirit might take the form of a wolf to wander the earth until proper rites were performed. Such beliefs were closely linked to burial practices and communal responsibility. A wolf appearing near a village could be interpreted as a restless soul in need of attention, or a warning that something had been neglected. In this context, the woman who conversed with wolves, even dead ones, was seen as someone who could interact with these spirits, whether by choice or by some innate, mystical talent. Wolves were also linked to moral lessons in folklore. They embodied cautionary tales for children and adults alike. Venture too far into the forest, ignore the warnings of elders, or stray from the path of righteousness, and you might encounter the wolf. These stories served multiple functions. They explained natural dangers, reinforced communal norms, and instilled a healthy respect for forces beyond human control. A woman claiming to speak to dead wolves was therefore not simply eccentric. She was interacting with entities that were, in the eyes of her community, both sacred and perilous. Additionally, wolves were often considered familiars or companions of those practicing witchcraft or folk magic. In European folklore, witches were sometimes believed to possess animal familiars, creatures that could act as messengers, spies, or conduits for supernatural power. While cats, crows, or toads were more commonly sighted, in the rugged wilderness of Norway, wolves could serve this symbolic role. A person who communicated with wolves, or who seemed to understand their speech, was instantly associated with otherworldly knowledge. It was an association that could inspire awe, fear, or even outright hostility. The wolf's dual nature, as both predator and spiritual symbol, meant that villagers viewed them with a mix of reverence and dread. They were powerful enough to kill livestock, yet enigmatic enough to suggest intelligence and intent beyond the natural world. Wolves were known to linger near settlements, appearing at the edge of human perception, especially at dawn or dusk, the liminal hours when the boundary between the visible and invisible seemed most fragile. It was during these times, according to accounts, that the woman would speak with them, whispering as though understanding a language that no one else could hear. Her supposed ability to communicate with these creatures placed her in a liminal space herself, mirroring the wolf's position between the human and natural, the living and the dead. The oral tradition surrounding wolves also emphasized memory, repetition, and moral caution. Every wolf story was a story passed from one generation to the next, often modified, embellished, and intensified. A single eerie encounter could transform into a tale of omens and messages from the afterlife. Villagers internalized these narratives, creating a cultural lens through which any unusual event, particularly one involving a solitary woman and wolves, could be interpreted as something extraordinary. By speaking to dead wolves, she was stepping directly into a pre-existing framework of fear and fascination that the community already understood. In addition, wolves served as mirrors for human behavior. They were social animals with pack dynamics, territorial instincts, and hunting strategies that could be observed and interpreted. The villagers often projected human qualities onto them: loyalty, cunning, vengeance, and grief. The idea that a woman could talk to wolves, even those that had died, resonated with a belief that humans and animals were linked in ways beyond ordinary perception. If a wolf was more than a wolf, perhaps humans, too, could transcend ordinary boundaries and connect with the spirits of these creatures. Finally, the cultural fear of wolves created a tension that amplified every encounter with them. A single wolf carcass in a snowy forest could become a scene of mystery, especially if someone unusual was nearby. The wolf became a canvas onto which villagers projected their fears, suspicions, and superstitions. When the woman allegedly spoke to these dead creatures, she was not merely interacting with corpses. She was engaging with a living symbol of all the dangers, omens, and moral lessons the community had internalized for generations. Her actions were interpreted through a lens that fused natural observation, mythology, and spiritual significance, making her story both believable and terrifying to those who lived alongside the forests. By understanding the folklore surrounding wolves, we can begin to see how the legend of the woman who spoke to the dead gained traction. Wolves were more than predators. They were spiritual intermediaries, moral teachers, and symbols of liminality. The woman's supposed connection to them was terrifying because it suggested she, too, had crossed a boundary that ordinary humans were warned to avoid. In a world where the line between life and death, natural and supernatural, was never fixed, she became a living bridge, a conduit for the fears and stories that wolves had carried through Norwegian folklore for centuries. The central figure of this chilling legend is as enigmatic as the wolves she was said to speak with. Her name, like many details of her life, has been lost to time, surviving only in fragments of oral history, scattered village records, and the whispers of hunters who claim to witness her uncanny interactions with the dead. In some accounts, she is referred to as the widow of Norway, a small, remote settlement nestled between the fjords and forests of Norway. She was a woman who lived on the margins, socially, economically, and spiritually, a position that would ultimately make her both fascinating and frightening to the people around her. From what historians and folklorists have pieced together, she was likely widowed at a relatively young age, a circumstance that in 18th century Norway could drastically alter a woman's life. Widows often found themselves isolated, struggling to manage farms, livestock, or households alone. Without the social protection afforded by a husband, a widow's behavior was scrutinized more closely, and any deviation from community norms could easily be interpreted as a sign of danger or impropriety. In her case, this marginalization may have intensified the mystique that surrounded her, creating fertile ground for rumor and speculation. Descriptions of her physical appearance are sparse, Yet the few accounts that survive portray a figure as unassuming as she was unusual. She reportedly wore practical clothing, suited to life on the edge of civilization, rough woolen garments, patched boots, and a heavy cloak to protect against the harsh Norwegian winters. Some villagers noted that she carried herself with a quiet confidence, moving through the forests as if she belonged more to the wilderness than to human society. Children were warned to avoid her path, not out of malice but out of fear that her presence was unnatural, a disruption to the normal rhythm of village life. Her reputation as a healer and folk practitioner likely contributed to the aura of mystery around her. In rural Norway, women who possessed knowledge of herbs, remedies, and traditional healing practices held a delicate position within their communities. They were valued for their skill but also feared for the perceived power they wielded beyond conventional medicine. The widow's alleged ability to converse with wolves, especially those long dead, would have positioned her in the minds of villagers as someone who had crossed the boundaries of the ordinary. To some, she was a protector, a wise woman who could anticipate danger and guide the village. To others, she was a harbinger of misfortune, someone in league with forces beyond comprehension. Stories suggest that her unusual behavior began subtly and escalated over time. Hunters claimed to see her standing near freshly killed wolf carcasses, whispering softly, as though receiving responses from creatures that had long ceased to live. Villagers recounted incidents where she wandered through the forests at night, seemingly listening to the wind or the rustle of branches, then returning with knowledge of events that had yet to occur, a coming storm, the illness of a neighbor, or the death of a stray animal. Such accounts, whether exaggerated or accurate, solidified her reputation as someone capable of crossing boundaries that ordinary people could not. The social dynamics of the village further amplified the legend. Isolated communities were inherently suspicious of outsiders, and even more so of those who defied social norms. A solitary woman walking at dusk in the forests, speaking to wolves, and claiming to understand their messages would naturally attract attention, curiosity, and fear. Gossip spread quickly, and oral storytelling amplified each incident, transforming small, ambiguous events into tales of supernatural communication. The more she interacted with wolves, the more her reputation grew, until it became inseparable from the myth itself. It is worth noting that while her legend centers on wolves, her abilities were often framed within broader terms of necromancy or spiritual insight. Villagers claimed she could sense the presence of spirits, interpret omens, and communicate with forces beyond the living. This association with the supernatural was not uncommon for women in her position. In a culture where folk healing and mystical practices overlapped, women like her were sometimes revered as wise oracles, but more often feared as witches or agents of dark forces. Her connection to wolves, creatures already entwined with death in folklore, only intensified this perception. Historical records hint at specific incidents that cemented her notoriety. One tale tells of a wolf that had been killed by hunters but was later seen wandering near the village. When questioned, she allegedly claimed to have spoken with its spirit, describing its movements, its thoughts, and even the names of the hunters who had slain it. Another account recounts a shepherd who followed her into the woods at night and heard guttural sounds, neither entirely human nor fully animal, emanating from a frozen wolf carcass. These stories, passed down orally and later documented by folklorists, contribute to the eerie aura that surrounds a figure. Psychologically, her behavior could have stemmed from a range of conditions, including grief, isolation, or even neurological or psychiatric factors that made her more attuned to environmental cues or internal hallucinations. Yet to the villagers of Norway, such explanations mattered little. In a world where superstition and the supernatural were real forces in daily life, the woman's abilities, whether mystical, imagined, or a combination of both, commanded attention and inspired caution. Ultimately, the woman of Norway became both a symbol and a story. She represented the intersection of human isolation, natural danger, and the mysteries that linger at the edges of understanding. Through her, the wolves of the forests were given a voice, and through the wolves, the villagers glimpsed forces they could neither fully control nor comprehend. Her life, shrouded in rumor and legend, illustrates how folklore, environment, and human psychology intertwine to create stories that endure long after the facts themselves are faded. As we explore the encounters that define her legend, we will see that the wolves themselves, both living and dead, play a central role in understanding why this woman became a figure of fear, fascination, and ultimately, a haunting presence in the folklore of Norway. The most haunting aspect of the legend lies not in the woman herself, but in the wolves she was said to communicate with, wolves that had been killed, their bodies left to the frost and snow, yet somehow, in the eyes of villagers, refused to stay dead. Hunters spoke of strange occurrences that defied both logic and natural law. A wolf slain in a trap one day might be seen wandering near the village the next, its corpse seemingly moved or rearranged as if guided by unseen hands. Livestock occasionally vanished after these incidents, and the villagers' imaginations ran wild. What force, and what human agency, could be behind such phenomena? The accounts suggest a pattern. Whenever a wolf was killed, the widow, or wolf speaker, as some called her, was reportedly nearby, whispering over the body in low, deliberate tones. Villagers claimed she would trace the contours of the animal with her hands, murmuring words that no one else could understand. Some hunters swore that the wolf's eyes, long dimmed, seemed to flicker with life as she spoke, though such descriptions may have been colored by fear or superstition. Children who wandered near the edges of the forest recalled strange growls or whispers that seemed to respond to her presence. The line between imagination and reality was blurred, leaving a persistent sense of unease that has echoed through generations. One particularly chilling account tells of a wolf killed during a winter hunt, its body left in a clearing to be retrieved later. When the hunters returned, the corpse was gone, only to be found days afterward near a distant part of the forest, as if it had traveled on its own. Some villagers claimed they saw the woman at the scene, kneeling beside the snow, murmuring to the air in ways that suggested communication with the dead animal. The hunters, unnerved and confused, spread the story through the village, embellishing details as fear and fascination grew. These stories often incorporated elements of prophecy. The woman was said not only to speak to wolves but also to receive knowledge from them, for warnings of storms, illnesses, or even deaths. A wolf carcass might answer her, she claimed, revealing where a hidden danger lurked or predicting misfortune for a particular household. Whether these revelations were coincidental, manipulated, or genuinely perceived by her is impossible to confirm. What is clear, however, is that the villagers came to regard her presence near dead wolves as a portent of something beyond ordinary understanding. The phenomenon of wolves refusing to stay dead also fed into the pre-existing fears of the supernatural. In Norwegian folklore, wolves were sometimes thought to carry the restless spirits of the deceased, returning to the living world to convey messages or seek vengeance. By appearing to revive or linger after death, the wolves in these tales reinforced the idea that the boundary between life and death was permeable, and that this woman was uniquely capable of crossing it. Her role as intermediary, both feared and revered, positioned her as a bridge between the human and the animal, the living and the dead. Observers described the interactions with a sense of awe and horror. Hunters, usually practical men accustomed to tracking and killing, admitted to feeling an almost reverential fear in her presence. They reported hearing low, guttural noises emanating from the carcasses when she approached, noises that were not entirely human nor fully animal. Some villagers swore that the wolves seemed to respond to her gestures, lifting limbs or turning heads as though alive. Even if these observations were the product of imagination, grief, or the eerie acoustics of the forests, they were recorded and retold as fact, cementing the legend in the collective memory. The community's reaction was as complex as the events themselves. Some people feared her, believing she wielded unnatural power and could bring harm if crossed. Others approached her cautiously, hoping to glean knowledge or protection from her abilities. This duality, of awe and fear, reverence and suspicion, reinforced her liminal status. She was a figure simultaneously outside and inside the social fabric, respected for her insight, yet feared for the uncontrollable forces she seemed to command. One persistent element of these accounts is the suggestion of ritual. The woman's interactions with the wolf corpses were not random. They followed a pattern of gestures, whispers, and careful positioning. Whether these actions were symbolic, spiritual, or practical in some unknown tradition, they gave the impression that the wolves were more than bodies. They were vessels of knowledge, channels for messages, or even participants in a strange dialogue. For the villagers, who interpreted the natural world through layers of superstition, the ritualized behavior amplified the sense that something uncanny was unfolding. Even the landscape contributed to the eerie quality of the story. Snow-covered forests and frozen clearings, echoing fjords, and long shadows cast by moonlight created an atmosphere in which ordinary events could appear extraordinary. Wolves moving silently across ice or snow could easily be misperceived as spirits or revenants. The woman's presence, combined with the villagers' expectations and fears, transformed ordinary hunting scenes into events of profound supernatural significance. The legend also emphasizes the timing of these encounters. Many reports describe her activity during the liminal hours, dusk or dawn, times when the boundary between day and night, reality and the supernatural, was believed to be thin. Wolves are naturally crepuscular, active during these periods, which coincided with the moments the villagers reported witnessing strange interactions. These details, whether coincidental or deliberately emphasized in storytelling, reinforced the impression that the woman had a unique connection to forces beyond human comprehension. Ultimately, the wolves that wouldn't stay dead symbolized the intersection of nature, superstition, and human imagination. They were the conduit through which the villagers experienced fear, wonder, and moral reflection. The woman's alleged ability to communicate with these creatures elevated her from eccentricity to legend, casting her as a figure who could navigate the threshold between life and death, natural and supernatural, ordinary and extraordinary. Her story is not merely about a solitary woman in a remote village. It is about the human need to interpret the unknown, and the power of folklore to give shape to the inexplicable. As we move forward, the narrative turns to the reactions of her community: fear, accusation, and the collision of folklore with the harsh realities of social judgment. It is here that the story of the wolf-speaking woman begins to intertwine with the darker threads of witchcraft, suspicion, and human cruelty. As her reputation grew, so too did the fear she inspired. In small, isolated communities like those in 18th century Norway, fear was a powerful force, one that could turn admiration into suspicion and curiosity into hostility. The woman who spoke to dead wolves had already placed herself in a delicate social position, a widow, living on the edge of the village, and engaged in behavior that defied ordinary understanding. To the villagers, her ability to converse with the dead, even through wolves, was not just unusual, it was dangerous. Soon, whispers of witchcraft began to surface, blending the folklore of wolves with centuries-old anxieties about women who wielded power beyond the ordinary. The European witch craze had largely subsided by 1790, but its cultural echoes remained. Stories of witches, familiars, and necromancers were deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness, particularly in rural communities. Norway had experienced its own brutal episodes of witch trials in the 17th century, leaving behind a legacy of fear and suspicion. Even decades later, villagers retained a heightened sensitivity to behaviors perceived as unnatural or threatening. In this context, the wolf-speaking woman was an easy target for speculation and fear. Her isolation, her mysterious abilities, and her unusual connection to wolves made her appear as someone in league with forces outside the community's control. Accounts suggest that her neighbors began to interpret ordinary events as evidence of her powers. When a storm struck unexpectedly, or livestock disappeared, or someone fell ill, villagers would whisper that she had called it forth. If a wolf carcass appeared strangely positioned in the snow, they would claim she had communicated with it to bring misfortune. Such interpretations were rarely questioned. In a world where survival was precarious and the unseen was ever present, superstition often outweighed reason. The boundaries between coincidence, natural phenomena, and malicious intent blurred, creating fertile ground for fear to flourish. Clergy in the region also played a role in shaping public perception. Lutheran ministers, while primarily concerned with spiritual guidance, were aware of the enduring power of folk belief. They often warned villagers against consorting with witches or dabbling in necromancy. The wolf-speaking woman's activities, especially her alleged communion with spirits, could be framed as heretical or dangerous in the eyes of religious authorities. Even if no formal charges were ever laid, the fear generated by such accusations could isolate her further, forcing her into a liminal position where community protection and suspicion existed side by side. Gender dynamics amplified the danger. Women who stepped outside expected social norms, particularly widows, were often scrutinized more intensely than men. Their knowledge of healing, herbs, and spiritual practices could be valued, but also feared. In the case of the wolf-speaking woman, her gender made her a symbolic figure in a story of transgression. She occupied a liminal space not only socially, but spiritually. Her interactions with wolves, creatures already associated with death and prophecy, transformed her from an eccentric woman into a figure who appeared to manipulate forces that should remain beyond human control. This perception made her both fascinating and threatening to the villagers. The social psychology of rumor also played a crucial role. Isolated communities relied heavily on oral storytelling to transmit news and cautionary tales. Each retelling of an event involving the woman and the wolves likely introduced embellishments, heightening fear and reinforcing her reputation. Hunters, farmers, and children contributed pieces of the story, each adding their own interpretations or moral lessons. Over time, these accounts coalesced into a narrative in which she was no longer simply a woman with unusual behaviors, but a potentially dangerous intermediary with the power to affect life, death, and fortune. Some of the fear surrounding her appears to have been ritualized. Villagers would avoid forests where she was known to travel, crossing themselves or muttering protective prayers when passing her dwelling. Livestock might be tied or hidden, and children warned not to venture near wolf carcasses. In this way, her presence influenced not only perception but daily behavior, reinforcing her role as a figure who could not be ignored. The very act of fearing her created a feedback loop that amplified the legend, making it increasingly difficult to separate fact from folklore. Stories also suggest that confrontations occurred, though details are scarce and often contradictory. Some accounts describe villagers attempting to force her to cease her unusual activities, only for storms or misfortunes to follow, further cementing her perceived powers. In other retellings, she was avoided entirely, allowed to continue her rituals in the forests, her reputation growing with each whispered tale of wolves that would not stay dead. Whether through active defiance, passive endurance, or simple circumstance, she became a figure around which both fear and fascination crystallized. The collision of folklore with social judgment created a delicate but dangerous equilibrium. She was never fully condemned in formal records, yet she was also never fully accepted. In the eyes of the villagers, she embodied the tension between curiosity and terror, wisdom and malice, human and supernatural. Her ability to communicate with wolves, creatures already seen as messengers of death, positioned her as both mediator and threat, bridging a world that ordinary villagers had been warned never to cross. By the end of this period, the woman had become more legend than person, a symbol of what occurs when isolation, fear, and folklore intersect. Her story illustrates the ways in which human communities respond to the unknown, with caution, imagination, and often hostility. It shows how fear can transform eccentricity into accusation, and how folklore can serve both to explain the unexplainable and to enforce social boundaries. The stage was now set for us to explore not only her possible motivations and psychological state, but also the broader cultural and scientific interpretations that could shed light on the extraordinary claims surrounding her life. As we move beyond the whispers, fears, and accusations, a different lens emerges, one that attempts to understand the woman who spoke to dead wolves through the realms of reason, psychology, and natural science. Was she truly communicating with spirits through wolves, as folklore insisted, or were there more earthly explanations for the strange events surrounding her? In isolated communities like Norway, the lines between the supernatural and natural were often blurred, but modern investigation allows us to explore multiple possibilities, blending historical context with contemporary understanding. One of the most compelling explanations centers on the human mind itself. Isolation, grief, and trauma can profoundly affect perception. If the woman was indeed widowed at a young age, living alone on the edge of harsh Norwegian forests, it is plausible that she experienced extreme psychological stress. Extended periods of solitude and exposure to the harsh elements could lead to vivid auditory or visual hallucinations. She may have genuinely believed that the wolves responded to her, interpreting the natural sounds of wind through trees, creaking ice, or the distant howls of actual wolves as communication. Her interactions could have been deeply sincere, yet misperceived by herself and others as mystical. Another consideration is the possibility of neurological or psychiatric conditions. Some behaviors described in the accounts, hearing voices, interpreting movements of dead animals as meaningful, perceiving signs of future events, could be consistent with forms of psychosis or schizophrenia. From a modern clinical perspective, these conditions can distort perception and create experiences that feel intensely real to the individual. In a society without access to mental health knowledge or treatment, such behavior would have been incomprehensible to villagers, easily interpreted as supernatural. Environmental factors may also have contributed to the legend. Norwegian forests, especially during winter, can produce eerie sounds. Snow and ice amplify certain noises, while echoes across fjords distort the source and nature of sounds. Wolves themselves, active during crepuscular hours, could produce vocalizations that seem unnatural when filtered through snow-laden valleys. Observers, especially children or those predisposed to fear, could interpret these sounds as something otherworldly. Coupled with the woman's solitary presence, these natural phenomena might have reinforced the belief that she was communicating with the dead. The role of confirmation bias cannot be overlooked. Once villagers heard reports of her unusual behavior, they were likely to interpret subsequent events in a way that confirmed existing beliefs. A wolf carcass positioned unusually by hunters, a sudden illness, or a lost lamb could be read as evidence of her mystical powers. Each retelling, Each embellished account strengthened the legend, creating a feedback loop where fear and fascination reinforced one another. Over time, the woman herself may have internalized these stories, consciously or unconsciously shaping her behavior to align with the village's expectations. There is also a potential element of social performance. In an environment where superstition governed perception, a woman with knowledge of herbs, animal behavior, and local customs could wield influence by performing rituals or gestures that appeared mystical. Whispering over wolf carcasses, tracing shapes in the snow, or observing certain postures could create the impression of communication with the dead. Even simple acts of keen observation, knowing when wolves were likely to hunt or predicting storms based on environmental cues, could be interpreted as supernatural insight. In essence, the combination of practical knowledge and the village's interpretive framework could transform ordinary actions into extraordinary events. Comparisons with other folklore traditions suggest that her experiences were not unique. Across Europe, tales exist of individuals believed to communicate with animals, spirits, or the dead. In the Sami shamanistic tradition of northern Scandinavia, shamans were thought to mediate between the living and the spiritual world, often using animals as conduits. While it is unlikely the woman was a formal practitioner of such traditions, her behaviors may have been influenced by a regional understanding that humans and animals share a deeper, mystical connection. To villagers steeped in superstition, these connections could easily be misinterpreted as witchcraft or necromancy. From a scientific perspective, the apparent resurrection of wolves can also be examined. Wolves are naturally elusive, and carcasses left in the forest are often scavenged, moved, or buried by other animals. Hunters returning to a site days later could reasonably find the remains displaced, giving the impression that the wolf had somehow returned. Snow, ice, and shifting terrain could further obscure tracking, creating an eerie sense of movement where none occurred. Combined with the woman's presence, these mundane explanations were easily woven into the fabric of legend. The interplay between psychology, environmental factors, and cultural context highlights a key theme. Extraordinary events often emerge from the intersection of natural phenomena and human interpretation. In her case, the combination of isolation, social status, psychological strain, and environmental conditions created the perfect conditions for her legend to flourish. Yet the persistence of the story, its survival for over 2 centuries, demonstrates that rational explanations do not diminish the power of folklore. Humans crave stories that blur the boundaries of the ordinary, and the wolf-speaking woman fits perfectly into this archetype. Finally, the story challenges us to consider the limits of explanation. Even if her behaviors can be analyzed through modern psychology or natural observation, the way she was perceived in her community remains a testament to the power of belief. The villagers' fear and awe were real, regardless of whether the supernatural events truly occurred. Legends are not simply about objective facts, they are about the meanings that communities ascribe to experiences, the fears they cannot name, and the mysteries that demand narrative. In examining science, madness, and myth, we gain a multidimensional understanding of the woman who spoke to dead wolves. She was, simultaneously, a product of her environment, a potential sufferer of psychological conditions, a keen observer of the natural world, and a figure whose actions were magnified by the interpretive framework of superstition and folklore. Her story exists at the crossroads of these forces, allowing us to explore the blurred boundary between reality and imagination, between human perception and the unknowable. As we move forward, we will explore the broader cultural context of speaking to the dead, tracing how her legend fits into European traditions of necromancy, shamanism, and mystical practices. It is here that the wolf-speaking woman becomes not just a local curiosity, but a part of a larger narrative about humanity's desire to communicate with forces beyond comprehension. The notion of speaking to the dead has haunted human imagination for millennia, and in 18th century Norway, it was not merely superstition, it was part of a broader cultural understanding of the world. Across Europe, necromancy and spirit communication occupied a liminal space, walking the line between forbidden magic, religious belief, and folk practice. In the case of the woman who spoke to dead wolves, her actions can be seen as part of this continuum, where the natural and supernatural intertwine to produce stories that unsettle the boundary between life and death. European folklore was rich with examples of humans interacting with spirits through animals. The wolf, already a potent symbol of death and transformation, served as a natural intermediary in these narratives. In some traditions, a slain animal could become a vessel for a spirit, lingering in the material world until proper rituals were performed. Others believe that an individual with a special connection to nature or the spiritual realm could perceive messages from the dead, whether through dreams, omens, or interactions with animals. To villagers steeped in these beliefs, the woman's whispered conversations with wolf carcasses were neither random nor meaningless. They were a form of necromantic practice, however unintentional it may have been. The woman's alleged abilities must also be understood in the context of survival. Life in rural Norway demanded acute awareness of the environment, including the behavior of predators. Wolves were both feared and studied. Knowing their patterns could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. Her conversations with the dead wolves may have begun as a form of observation or ritualized attention to their movements, vocalizations, and patterns. Over time, these practical exercises could have been perceived by villagers as mystical communication, especially when coupled with her apparent insights into forthcoming dangers or unusual events. Ritualized behavior, such as whispering to the dead or performing gestures over carcasses, was common in folk practices across Europe. Shamans, wise women, and healers often engaged in symbolic acts intended to influence outcomes, interpret messages, or maintain harmony with natural forces. Even if the woman was not formally trained in such traditions, she may have instinctively adopted behaviors aligned with older, regional practices. In this sense, her actions were both culturally intelligible and profoundly unsettling, blurring the line between observation, ritual, and supernatural communication. The connection between wolves and spirits in Norwegian folklore also reflects a deep understanding of animal behavior. Wolves were seen as intelligent, social creatures capable of memory and emotion, qualities that allowed humans to anthropomorphize them in ways that were psychologically compelling. By interpreting subtle cues from wolves, movement, vocalizations, or positioning, she may have been reading patterns that others overlooked. To the villagers, this skill seemed impossible, but from a practical perspective, it was an advanced, albeit misunderstood, form of environmental attunement. Religious belief added another layer of complexity. Lutheran Christianity dominated Norway in the 18th century, yet older pagan beliefs persisted, particularly in remote regions. The coexistence of these spiritual systems meant that practices perceived as necromantic could be interpreted in multiple ways, as heretical magic, as superstition, or even as divine insight. The woman existed at the intersection of these belief systems, embodying the tension between sanctioned religious practices and folk interpretations of the unseen. Her wolf interactions were therefore a focal point for both fascination and fear, a liminal space where morality, spirituality, and folklore converged. Oral tradition played a critical role in shaping the story. Villagers would recount her interactions with the wolves repeatedly, adding embellishments, moral lessons, or supernatural details with each retelling. A casual observation, such as the wolf carcass moving slightly in the snow, could become a tale of spiritual resurgence, where the animal spirit refused to rest until the woman intervened. These stories reinforced community norms, teaching respect for the natural and supernatural while simultaneously ensuring that fear and vigilance remained alive. The concept of necromancy itself was broad in rural Europe, encompassing everything from formal rituals to informal practices that bridged life and death. In many communities, women were particularly associated with these forms of mediation. As healers, widows, or solitary figures, they occupied a liminal space where their knowledge and abilities were both valued and feared. The wolf-speaking woman fits this archetype, a solitary figure whose unusual behaviors were interpreted as powerful, dangerous, and deeply uncanny. Her story demonstrates how cultural context shapes the perception of seemingly inexplicable phenomena. Moreover, her legend highlights the human desire to find meaning in death. Wolves, already associated with mortality, became symbols through which villagers could process loss, danger, and uncertainty. By engaging with the carcasses, the woman appeared to tap into knowledge beyond the ordinary, providing insight into events that seemed random or threatening. Whether her abilities were mystical, practical, or imagined, they fulfilled a psychological and social function, offering the community a way to navigate fear and maintain a sense of order in a chaotic and unpredictable environment. Finally, the story challenges modern assumptions about rationality and superstition. To contemporary eyes, her actions may appear as madness, performance, or misinterpretation, but in her historical and cultural context, they made profound sense. She existed in a world where the natural and supernatural coexisted, where wolves carried omens, and where individuals could occupy spaces between life and death. Her interactions with the dead wolves were a form of communication, ritual, and understanding that bridged multiple realms of knowledge and belief. In exploring necromancy or nature, we see that the woman's legend is more than a story of a solitary eccentric. It is a lens through which to examine human perception, environmental awareness, cultural belief, and the psychological mechanisms that give rise to myth. The wolves she spoke to were not merely animals, they were symbols, teachers, and intermediaries in a complex dialogue between life, death, and the human imagination. As the years passed in the late 18th century, the woman who spoke to dead wolves gradually became less of a local curiosity and more of a figure entrenched in folklore. The last sightings reported by villagers paint a chilling picture, one that blends reality, imagination, and the enduring power of fear. These final encounters, preserved in oral histories and fragmentary records, illustrate how her legend solidified, transforming her from a solitary woman into a symbol of the uncanny forces that lurk at the edges of human understanding. The final reported sightings occurred on the outskirts of the village, where the forests thickened and wolves were known to roam freely. Hunters and farmers occasionally glimpsed her moving through the trees, often at dawn or dusk, the liminal hours when light and shadow merged. She was described as walking silently, her posture deliberate, her gaze fixed on the snow-covered ground or on the remains of a recently slain wolf. Witnesses claimed that she spoke softly, murmuring words that could not be heard clearly but were believed to be part of her secret dialogue with the dead. These sightings were sparse but vivid, leaving a lasting impression on those who observed her. One account tells of a hunter tracking a wolf pack near a frozen river. He paused as he noticed a figure kneeling beside the body of a wolf, whispering and tracing shapes in the snow. The hunter claimed that the wolf's eyes seemed to flicker, as if acknowledging her presence, and that the carcass shifted subtly, though no wind or animal could explain it. This story, like many others, was relayed orally, with details often exaggerated or dramatized, but the core narrative persisted. The woman maintained her connection with the dead wolves until her final days. Children in the village, who had grown up hearing the stories, were particularly attuned to her presence. They would recount seeing her standing silently in the forest, sometimes accompanied by the low, mournful howls of wolves in the distance. In these tales, the wolves were almost spectral, their sounds carrying messages of warning, grief, or prophecy. The woman, always at the center of these encounters, was depicted as a mediator, a solitary figure who could bridge the gap between the living and the dead, between human society and the mysteries of the wild. By the time the last sightings occurred, the villagers' attitude toward her had crystallized into a mixture of fear, awe, and cautious respect. Adults warned children to avoid the forests where she walked, while hunters and elders debated the truth of the stories. Some believed she possessed genuine supernatural power, others assumed she was eccentric, a solitary figure whose knowledge of wolves and the environment gave the illusion of mystical abilities. Regardless of interpretation, her presence had become inseparable from the identity of the surrounding forest, a living legend intertwined with the rhythms of the natural world. It is also important to consider the social context of these final sightings. Villages in 1790s Norway were small, and social cohesion was vital for survival. A woman who appeared outside accepted norms, whose behaviors could not be easily categorized, represented both a threat and a fascination. Her interactions with dead wolves were a reminder that nature, and the forces that governed life and death, could never be fully controlled. The stories of her final appearances reinforced communal boundaries, teaching vigilance while allowing the imagination to explore the supernatural. The way the stories were passed down is equally significant. Oral tradition, particularly in isolated communities, amplifies memory through repetition, embellishment, and moral framing. Each retelling of her final sightings added layers. The wolves became more spectral, her actions more deliberate, and the consequences more portentous. Over time, the events coalesced into a coherent legend, one that was less about her individual life and more about the archetype she represented, a solitary woman who communed with death through the spirits of wolves. Another striking element of the last sightings is the subtle interplay of fear and fascination. Witnesses often described a mixture of terror and awe, feelings that suggest a complex psychological response to her presence. Fear alone would have discouraged attention, yet curiosity drew observers to the forests despite warnings. This duality, simultaneous avoidance and observation, ensured that her actions, and the wolves she communed with, remained a central feature of village lore long after she vanished from daily life. The apparent disappearance of the woman did little to diminish her legend. Even after she was no longer physically present, villagers continued to report unusual wolf activity, strange sounds in the forest, or sightings of shadowy figures. These posthumous accounts reinforced the idea that her connection to the wolves, and to forces beyond the human realm, endured beyond her life. In essence, she had become inseparable from the mythos of the forest itself, a lingering presence whose influence transcended mortality. Modern folklore scholars note that such figures often function as cultural touchstones. They embody the fears, hopes, and moral lessons of the community, serving as anchors for collective memory. In the case of the wolf-speaking woman, her legend reflects the precarious balance between survival, superstition, and imagination in an isolated environment. She represents the human impulse to explain the unexplainable, to give voice to the dead through the living, and to navigate a world where the boundaries between life and death are fragile and porous. Finally, the last sightings underscore the enduring power of narrative. Even centuries later, the story of the woman who spoke to dead wolves continues to captivate, in part because it exists at multiple levels: historical, psychological, and symbolic. It is a story of survival and fear, of isolation and fascination, of the interplay between humans and the natural world. By examining these final appearances, we see how the legend solidified, evolving from a series of isolated events into a lasting narrative that continues to haunt both imagination and folklore. The story of the woman who spoke to dead wolves did not end with her disappearance or death. Rather, it evolved into a cultural touchstone, passed down through generations and adapted into the broader fabric of Norwegian folklore. Her legend offers insight not only into the fears and beliefs of 18th century rural communities but also into humanity's enduring fascination with the boundary between life and death, the natural and the supernatural, and the human and animal worlds. Over time, her narrative transformed from local oral history into a symbol of mystery, resilience, and the uncanny. Immediately following her final sightings, the villagers of Norway continued to recount her story, emphasizing both her extraordinary abilities and the lessons embedded in her encounters with wolves. She became a figure whose actions were at once cautionary and awe-inspiring, a person to be wary of, yet also a conduit to a realm beyond ordinary perception. Young children were warned not to venture into the forest at dusk, lest they encounter her, or the restless spirits of the wolves she had communed with. For adults, her legend reinforced moral, social, and environmental norms. Respect the wild, honor the dead, and recognize forces beyond your comprehension. As oral tradition spread beyond her immediate community, the story took on new layers. Folklorists and storytellers in the 19th and early 20th centuries collected accounts of her life, often embellishing them with elements drawn from broader European necromantic and witchcraft traditions. These retellings amplified the supernatural aspects, framing her as a mystical woman who bridged worlds, communicated with spirits, and wielded knowledge that surpassed human understanding. In some narratives, her connection to the wolves became more symbolic, representing humanity's complicated relationship with nature, mortality, and instinctual wisdom. Her legend also influenced artistic and literary interpretations. Writers exploring the macabre, the uncanny, and the mystical drew inspiration from her story, highlighting themes of isolation, communion with nature, and the blurred line between life and death. In Scandinavian literature, tales of women with supernatural abilities often occupy a liminal space, and the wolf-speaking woman fits squarely within this archetype. She represents a figure who is simultaneously powerful, marginalized, and intimately connected to forces that ordinary humans fear or fail to comprehend. Modern interpretations of her story continue to explore these themes. Contemporary folklorists, historians, and even paranormal enthusiasts examine her legend not merely as a curiosity, but as a case study in the intersection of environment, psychology, and cultural belief. Her life raises questions about human perception, social dynamics, and the ways communities construct meaning from events they cannot explain. Wolves, already potent symbols of danger, intelligence, and liminality, become a lens through which we explore her legacy, an embodiment of the unknown that humans have always sought to understand or control. The psychological dimensions of her legend remain a focal point for discussion. Researchers suggest that her behavior may have arisen from a combination of isolation, trauma, and a deep attunement to the natural world. In a society without formal mental health frameworks, these behaviors would be interpreted through superstition and folklore. Yet, in modern analysis, we can appreciate her as a complex individual navigating extraordinary circumstances, whose story illuminates both human vulnerability and resilience. Her legacy bridges the gap between historical fact and myth, demonstrating how lived experiences can become symbols that resonate across time. Her story also intersects with ecological and environmental understanding. Wolves were, and remain, creatures both feared and revered. In rural communities, knowledge of their behavior was essential for survival. The woman's perceived communication with these animals may have been, in part, a reflection of careful observation and intimate familiarity with predator behavior. In this light, Her legend represents not only spiritual or mystical interpretation but also a human attempt to understand and navigate a dangerous, untamed environment. This duality, practical knowledge entwined with supernatural interpretation, is a hallmark of folklore, where survival and storytelling merge. The enduring fascination with a tale can also be traced to the universal human desire to confront mortality and the unknown. The idea of speaking to the dead, of interacting with creatures that carry messages from beyond, addresses deep-seated fears and curiosities. Her story persists because it speaks to something fundamental: the need to understand death, to communicate with what is lost, and to find meaning in the spaces where life and death intersect. Wolves, with their liminal presence at the edges of human settlements and their symbolic resonance in myth, amplify this fascination, making the legend both compelling and haunting. In the modern era, her story has found new audiences. Podcasts, documentaries, and online forums exploring dark history and macabre folklore frequently reference her life, framing her as an archetype of the mysterious woman who walks between worlds. Her narrative resonates with contemporary fascination for the unexplained. The blending of history, psychology, and supernatural speculation creates a compelling story that appeals to audiences seeking immersive, eerie tales rooted in cultural memory. Even without historical certainty, the power of the legend persists, demonstrating the resilience of folklore and its ability to captivate the imagination across centuries. Finally, her legacy reminds us of the fragility and power of human memory. Over generations, details may be lost, altered, or romanticized, but the essence of her story, the solitary woman who conversed with dead wolves, remains. It serves as a reminder of the ways humans interpret the unknown, project fears and hopes onto the natural world, and create narratives that endure long after individual lives have ended. In the forests of Norway, where snow blankets the ground and shadows stretch across the fjords, her story lives on, a haunting echo of the past that continues to stir curiosity, wonder, and unease. The woman who spoke to dead wolves is more than a figure of folklore. She is a symbol of humanity's relationship with nature, mortality, and the mysterious forces that shape our understanding of the world. Her legend endures because it taps into universal themes: the allure of the unknown, the intersection of life and death, and the profound mysteries that dwell at the margins of human experience. Through her story, we glimpse not only the fears and beliefs of 18th century Norway but also the enduring human fascination with the supernatural and the macabre. Beyond its eerie allure, the legend of the woman who spoke to dead wolves offers profound insights into history, culture, and human psychology. At first glance, it might appear to be a simple story of superstition and isolated eccentricity, but a closer examination reveals layers of meaning that illuminate the lives, beliefs, and social dynamics of 18th century Norway. Her story serves as a lens through which we can better understand how communities interpreted the unknown, constructed social norms, and negotiated the boundaries between life, death, and nature. One of the most immediate lessons concerns the role of isolation in shaping both behavior and perception. Life in rural Norway was harsh, with long winters, limited communication with neighboring villages, and dependence on natural resources for survival. Isolation magnified the effects of grief, loneliness, and social scrutiny, particularly for widowed or marginalized individuals. The woman's solitary existence not only contributed to her unusual behaviors but also heightened the village's attention to them. In small communities, deviations from accepted norms were noticed and remembered, often transforming ordinary actions into symbols of the supernatural. Her story demonstrates how environmental and social isolation can shape human perception, creating conditions in which folklore and legend flourish. The narrative also highlights the power of folklore as both explanation and caution. In a world without modern science or reliable methods to understand disease, weather, or animal behavior, stories of supernatural intervention help communities make sense of uncertainty. The woman's interactions with wolves, her perceived ability to communicate with the dead, and her role as an intermediary between natural and spiritual forces provided a framework for understanding events that were otherwise inexplicable. Wolves wandering near human settlements, sudden deaths of livestock, or harsh winter storms could all be interpreted through the lens of her legend, offering psychological comfort in a dangerous and unpredictable world. Gender plays a central role in the legend as well. The story reflects broader societal attitudes toward women, particularly those who operated outside conventional roles. As a widow living alone, the woman was vulnerable to suspicion, yet her unique abilities, perceived or real, gave her a form of power. Her gender amplified both fear and fascination. She could be seen as wise and mystical, or dangerous and unnatural. This duality demonstrates how cultural narratives often link women with liminality, particularly in folklore, where female figures frequently occupy spaces between human and supernatural, known and unknown. Her story provides a window into the gendered dynamics of suspicion, authority, and power in historical rural communities. Another lesson lies in the interplay between human observation and environmental knowledge. The woman's connection with wolves may have been grounded in acute observation of animal behavior, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. What villagers interpreted as supernatural communication could have been, in part, sophisticated understanding of natural cues. This emphasizes how traditional knowledge, often dismissed in modern times as superstition, played a crucial role in survival. It also underscores the human tendency to ascribe mystical qualities to those who possess specialized understanding, particularly when combined with social marginality or ritualized behavior. The story also illustrates the mechanisms of rumor and collective memory. Villagers, hunters, and children all contributed to the oral transmission of a legend, often embellishing or dramatizing events. These narratives reinforced social cohesion by providing common reference points for behavior, moral lessons, and cautionary tales. At the same time, they demonstrate the human capacity to shape perception through storytelling. Repetition, anticipation, and fear magnify the extraordinary aspects of everyday life, creating legends that endure long after the original events have passed. The cultural resonance of wolves adds another dimension to the lessons of the legend. Wolves, long associated with danger, cunning, and death, served as both literal and symbolic intermediaries in her story. Their presence reinforced the perception of her abilities and amplified the psychological impact of her actions. Across cultures, humans have projected meaning onto animals, particularly predators, and this projection helps explain why the legend has endured. The woman's story demonstrates how animal symbolism interacts with human belief systems, reinforcing narratives that link the natural and supernatural worlds. From a historical perspective, the legend provides insight into the values, fears, and priorities of 18th century Norwegian communities. Villagers sought explanations for events they could not control, respected those who demonstrated knowledge or skill, and feared forces beyond their comprehension. The wolf-speaking woman's story exemplifies how folklore functions as both a record of lived experience and a framework for understanding the unknown. It reflects the challenges of life in isolated regions, the social consequences of nonconformity, and the human need to find meaning in mortality and mystery. Finally, the legend reminds us of the enduring power of storytelling. Across centuries, her tale has captivated audiences, inspiring fascination, fear, and imagination. It demonstrates how stories can evolve, absorb cultural influences, and persist beyond the life of the individual. The woman who spoke to dead wolves continues to serve as a symbol of the unknown, a figure whose actions challenge rationality while embodying the very human desire to bridge the gap between life, death, and the natural world. Her story teaches us that folklore is not merely entertainment. It is a lens through which humans interpret their environment, negotiate social norms, and confront existential questions. In essence, the historical and cultural lessons of her legend extend far beyond the forests of Nordfjordeid. They reveal the complexity of human perception, the interplay between social structures and superstition, and the ways communities construct meaning from the inexplicable. They also remind us that legends endure because they speak to universal human experiences: fear, curiosity, grief, and the desire to understand forces beyond our control. By examining her story, we gain insight not only into the past but also into the timeless processes through which humans create, preserve, and transform the narratives that define their world.